Afternoon, everyone. Okay, so what I'm going to speak about today is the developer-led versus centralized grid connection solution options, and I suppose it underlines a strategy as much as a policy that will dictate how offshore wind connects in the next 10, maybe 20 years on the island of Ireland. So I suppose the first thing I'm going to do is just give a quick overview. Most people in the room probably know this already, but just to set the scene for, I think, all of our speakers here this afternoon, what developer-led is and what centralized is. So some key characteristics of developer-led solutions are developers, as is traditional in onshore wind in Ireland, fund costs to identify the grid and secure rights for suitable sites themselves through their own DevEx costs on a project. Bespoke connection applications are made to the TSO on a project-by-project basis. Grid access systems facilitate individual connection applications on an agreed allocation basis. So again, similar to the current regime and onshore, the grid access is through gate type systems or enduring type systems, but is on a bespoke project by project basis. Nearshore projects, again being specific to offshore and to Ireland individually, nearshore projects can access near coast transmission networks which are near the large load centres at the moment, which are east and south coast, on a developer-led solution at present at least, in a much shorter time frame than a centrally led solution could possibly do. This would allow projects that are successful in achieving planning consent to progress without being queued against other projects that are offered grid but maybe don't achieve planning. This is a successful connection philosophy used in the UK to date. There's been other experiences throughout Europe and throughout the world in general on how this is done. There's lots of nuances within that itself as to how grid access regimes are funded, how they're designed, but the philosophy in the UK to date has been developer-led. So moving on, centralised key characteristics is where the TSO, or indeed in Ireland the transmission asset owner, will design, consent and build common offshore hubs. So these hubs will be located around the coast of Ireland, more than likely starting on the east coast, whereby a philosophy of centralising and optimising will be used. This is where the TAO will prioritise and effectively choose the offshore locations. This in Ireland, again, taking offshore as an example, has led in the past to some issues that projects that have different development life cycles and are at different stages in their development life cycle dictate the speed at which the projects progress. For example, a project which maybe is lagging a different project in its planning consent cycle will dictate the timeline for all projects who connect to that specific hub or node or subgroup, as it may be. Another characteristic of centralized approaches, developers compete to win the right to specifically allocate areas, including their grid connection. This is something that is not specific to the TAO and the TSO, and is more an Ireland Inc. approach to allocating specific waters. It was touched on earlier on today with respect to how that would be dealt with in any process where there may be a planning interest type solution involved, and the rules and criteria and timelines around that planning interest in itself. This, as I pointed out a minute ago, is similar but not identical to subgroup arrangements. Those who there are many of in the room here today who've experienced subgroups, both from a distribution and transmission perspective on the island of Ireland, have seen how, while they do optimize the eventual solution, they, through the very nature of requiring many different vested interests and many different parties to connect, who again have different life cycles in their projects, can cause difficulties and has caused significant difficulties for onshore projects in the past. One point to just show some context, again, this is a preferred solution, or has been a preferred solution in countries such as the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark. But one point to note, and I've just put it in brackets there, design for those centralized type approaches commenced over 20 years ago in some instances. So there was and is a significant lead time to implementing the solutions for a centralized approach, and they worked very well, and the implementation of those solutions has delivered. But as I just said, it was over a significant period of time. Hybrid connections, for a point, have also been used in Germany and Denmark, and Denmark is an interesting example insofar as they have a centralized and developer-led approach, whereby there is some centralized solutions, but there's also near-shore developer-led solutions being proposed in Denmark and implemented per se. So some developer-led pros and cons, I think, and I'm trying to show some context around both the pros and cons of both solutions. So pros of a developer-led solution, I think in the near term at least, facilitates faster build-out of projects. It allowed a processing of connection applications for projects that have achieved the necessary consents and grid access where required. It avoids creation of subgroups, as I outlined before. The cost of site investigation is borne by the developer, and any development costs associated with that is to the cost of the developer, and not as may be the case in a centralized approach to the department or other bodies who go and explore waters that they may deem suitable or unsuitable for offshore development. The developer planning application is holistic in its nature. It covers the onshore grid connection, obviously the offshore, the port, any other upgrades, any other planning consent requirements necessary to implement an offshore project. As everyone again is probably aware, the project splitting and the path that's being travelled by onshore wind has been difficult, to say the least, when it comes to the splitting or bespoke planning applications for grid elements, mainstay, party or wind turbine elements, maybe other infrastructure such as site access, or in this particular case, onshore ports. Some cons of the developer-led solution, there is undoubtedly potential for suboptimal use of the transmission network. There may be, because of that, additional costs in the near term to the consumer in an auction type approach. There may be overlap of applications in an attempt to secure optimum sites, and how that gets managed is still to be decided, and it isn't an easy solution. Higher costs and risk to the developer in a con, which again, through a bid price, the cost of failure needs to be taken into account when a developer is developing out a project. And there is more onshore planning applications for a developer in this type of approach, where it's not centralized, and the risk of onshore planning elements to an offshore project are borne by the system operator or other party. So centralized approach. Central planned use of transmission infrastructure, again, it's optimal, it's a way to go. It's a least cost solution. I think that's pretty much acknowledged that in a utopian world, we'll have grid that is the optimal use of the infrastructure built. The areas of development are more controlled. There's less onshore planning implications for the developer, as is quid pro quo of the previous slide. Far shore and weak transmission grid areas, we feel, do have real merit in being centralized, and I'll get onto that in a moment. The cons of this are the time frame from design to delivery. The design by the TSO and TAO is something that has been done in the past with varying degrees of success, and the risk we feel is too great at the moment for us to go down the road of commencing a process of centralised design, facilitating offshore off the coast of Ireland. The subgroup solution, as I outlined before, where critical mass is needed, is just not feasible, we feel, for offshore type projects. There's a large cost to the state in gathering the information and data, geophysical information, etc., that may not result in the build out of particular areas. And there's higher potential for project splitting and the risk of Energia and judicial reviews, etc., coming to pass in this particular scenario. And we feel it could take longer, as I outlined before, than the developer-led approach. So just to give some insight, or to reiterate our 1 gigawatt by 2025, our 3.5 gigawatts by 2030 targets that we're trying to meet. We feel that designing, consenting and building offshore hubs will, just by their very nature, delay offshore project planning applications, which in turn will delay grid connection and result in us not achieving those 70-30 targets. The Climate Action Plan itself, in particular, outlines a 9-month process to achieve wind farm and grid planning consent from identification of suitable zones. That doesn't marry with the process of going through a centralised grid connection process. So what's the solution? I suppose we try to get answers as much as we can, and I suppose we're open to discuss this, but what we think maybe is a solution, like a lot of these things, is a hybrid or a mix of both. We think a phasing of developer-led followed by centrally led would work well. Legacy projects, as discussed earlier on, and in turn some enduring projects could enter into a developer-led system right now, get away, create the industry, as was outlined by the previous speaker, 2 gigawatts in 11 years, is because that industry had to build in the UK and had to grow. And then once it is established and has a footprint and a supply chain, it can exponentially grow from that point onwards. And we feel that phase 2 and phase 3 should facilitate that exponential growth in the future through centralised studies commencing now, maybe in the North Coast, maybe in the West Coast, to allow hubs be created, optimal use of infrastructure, etc. And again, in parallel with that phase 2 can be a phase 3, which, as previous speakers outlined, could be further shore type solutions, which are hubs, etc., as per what looks like it's going to be the case in the UK. The proposed solution, we think, it allows in development and legacy projects in which significant investments are already being made to proceed. It facilitates the optimum design of phase 2 and phase 3, which is least cost to the consumer in the long term. And in summary, we think, and we recognise in the offshore industry the benefits of a centralised design. We're not denying that. We think it's appropriate in the medium to long term. However, if we are to achieve our 2030 targets, we feel the only solution is a developer-led solution. We'd call on EirGrid to commence a centralised design while facilitating developer-led solutions now, and we welcome their input this afternoon. And that's me. 1 minute, 12 seconds to spare.